To today's CUGC Connect with Goliath Technologies. I am happy that we have back with us today Raja Jadeja. Sorry, Raja. I don't know why I got tongue-tied. Happy to have him back with us today. He's done a few webinars with us at CUGC, so I'm excited about what he has to show us today. Before we get into the presentation, just want to introduce our moderator. He is CTP Fellow and CUGC member extraordinaire, Carl Webster. Carl will be keeping an eye on your questions in the question box of the control panel off to the right. So please type those in as you have them, and he'll keep an eye on those. And we'll try to ask some during the presentation and some at the end, so don't be shy. Webster, would you like to say hello really quickly?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. Also want to point out that my employer, Choice Solutions, we are a partner with Goliath, and we actually use Goliath for our managed services business. And so, hey, I am glad you are here and hope you enjoy what you're about to find out.
Thanks, Webster. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things right over to Raja to get us started. I know he has a lot to get into today, so away we go.
Awesome. So thanks so much, Stephanie and Webster. Looking forward to the rest of this webinar, any of the questions that you bring up along the way. Over the course of this webinar, our goal is to talk a little bit about how you can leverage our technology to troubleshoot certain circumstances that you might encounter. Troubleshooting in Citrix is challenging enough as it is, and we're going to give you some quick ways to get to the heart of the matter and what problems are taking place. Before we do that, I do have a couple slides. I know that can get a little bit boring. It won't take very long. It's just going to introduce a little bit some of the concepts and put some perspective on how we approach things, and then set up the actual use cases as well. And then, of course, at the end, we have some time for Q&A too. So just broadly speaking, when issues take place in a Citrix environment, they usually kind of fall into one of the three boxes you see at the bottom. So the least frequently, but perhaps the most painful, is when users can't get into Citrix, as everyone scrambles to kind of identify what's happening and get them back in. And we'll show you how we kind of address that. Problems with the logon process, slow logons, whether users are complaining about them and they're not necessarily slow, or they truly are slow, and getting to the root cause of what's causing it. And the ubiquitous circumstances around whether session performance issues, and being able to dig into the lower level architecture and correlate what's happening at that level to how user sessions are being perceived to the users themselves. So I'm going to talk about all those different components and how we help address those different types of issues that do take place. And so when we have spoken with our customers in the past, how we kind of approached all of this is that they've come to us wanting to understand a little bit better how they can understand and predict when users are having problems, whether they're one of those three issues or not. Being able to actually confirm that they actually truly have access to the apps before they come in, so they don't have some issue that might be pending that they're not aware of. Being able to get to the root cause by getting visibility across all those different components that support Citrix, and then being able to do some sort of remediation or self-healing. A lot of admins are leveraging PowerShell to automate resolutions, or could be, and how they can leverage our tools to take that first step. Having the ability to kind of centrally manage and gain visibility to systems that are spread across multiple sites, geographies, and wherever those users truly are. And then be able to actually provide a screenshot of proof when there's problems, whether it's a successful environment and they're being told that it's not, or there truly is a failure. So we'll show you how we bring all that data together along the way. Now, broadly speaking, one of the solutions that we use, and it's kind of the starting point as we get into troubleshooting, starts with our application availability monitor. Just to kind of frame that up, and just so we have an understanding how that fits into the overall troubleshooting perspective, one of the problems that we've heard from customers is that when users are having issues, they're quick to say everything is down, or when help desk gets a certain volume of tickets, they might start wondering that maybe there's some broader issue. When we deliver and deploy our technology to Application Availability Monitor, we start providing incontrovertible evidence about whether or not the entire network is truly available or not. Are there sites that are having network configuration related issues? If there's an issue with the actual infrastructure that delivering it, whether it's at the NetScaler, storefront, delivery controller, protocol level. Same thing is true with the other platforms if you have a hybrid environment. During the actual launch phase process, as users are looking for the apps that they need to actually launch, or desktop for that matter, are they truly there or not? Sometimes they disappear following updates and changes in the environment. A failure to actually launch the session, the actual session hosts are not responding, or having some kind of objective evidence of, should they actually be launching quickly or in a reasonable time frame, or is there a broader problem that's actually might be affecting multiple users? So this actually factors into the overall troubleshooting spectrum, and this is one aspect of what we do, and something that our customers deploy as a starting mechanism, as a baseline for the environment, if you will. Uptimes and SLAs are pretty ubiquitous across customers. This is a more effective way of achieving that. So in a general environment, to give you an idea where this kind of fits in, we deploy our application availability monitor to a office location where users generally are. And by doing that, it gives us some perspective. So if you look at the map itself, we can actually understand that is there one site that's down by understanding that everything else is up and working successfully. We can actually get an idea if there's individual users that are running into problems, or if we see multiple offices where the application availability monitor is deployed, having issues, understand that there's a whole region being affected or globally. The technology is deployed at those different sites and is then establishing Citrix sessions, full Citrix sessions, by signing into your data center, which in this case might be located in Kansas City. So we're going to be establishing and launching sessions and testing that and confirming it, giving you help desk the way of looking at the board and saying, is there a broader issue, and validating or invalidating that that's the case. So what it really does is it kind of exercises the entire workflow. One of the challenges with traditional means of providing this type of visibility is that normal ping and Windows Service Check will just tell you if your services are up or not. That's not going to really tell you if Citrix is working or not and giving you that baseline of overall availability. By actually executing the workflow and exercising and confirming configuration, then you truly know that things are up or not. You can have servers that are down and have that result in their and still be successful in delivering a session, and at the same time you could have everything up and responding positively and still have users experiencing an issue. So from those endpoints, starting on the left-hand side, the application availability monitor initiates the connection, passing through the NetScaler, the storefront to the actual underlying architecture, and then establishing a session. When it does that, it has the ability to identify if there's any kind of a problem along the way, and if there is, indicate if there's a failure or not. So with that in mind, we can actually, just moving that a little bit further along, if there is, for example, a problem with Active Directory, it'll identify that for us and tell us about those errors, sending an alert notification to let us know about that, either through a text message to your mobile device or to email for that matter as well. So let's talk about how this kind of fits together with the rest of our technology, and let's talk more about the issues that are commonly we see with our customers and how we kind of dig into those metrics to identify what's happening, how you can actually put the technology to work to actually identify those circumstances and really speed up your resolution timeframes. One of our customers, and Webster, don't get mad at me, is MTM. And they actually provide both uptime and they provide hosting solutions and also managed services for a number of customers. One of those solutions that they offer from a hosting perspective is the Anywhere app. And they use our application availability monitor to prove that the service is up and available. They actually had a need for confirming that for a compliance and affirmation or that they're achieving their SLAs. There have been some circumstances where users have been reporting about slowness, and they wanted to be able to better be able to confirm that that was taking place and then be able to actually identify those circumstances and address them. They had some alerts that were set up along the way for identifying when there's slow logons. They had a number of customers that had some more complex delivery of apps and requirements around that, and understanding how their ability to actually achieve that and helping them troubleshoot some of those circumstances, and giving the help desk tools to make sure that they had something that can support a multi-tenant environment for one, and then two, when problems took place, being able to identify those quickly. So a couple of circumstances there that we'll talk about. They have, by the way, both Zen apps and desktop. They're delivered on Zen server with NetScaler in front of it. The other one is CHI, Catholic Health Initiatives. They had a specific circumstance where following an update to the environment, they thought that there was going to be no issues. We actually helped them identify a problem that would have impacted availability for about 40,000 users. We'll talk about how that kind of came together, how we identified that, how they were able to resolve it very quickly using our technology. So that's something that was really important for them because they were able to avert a big problem that would have happened otherwise. There's another use case that we'll go through along the way around network conditions causing disconnects, how we're able to leverage a combination or a visibility to the ICA channel and event logs to get to the root cause of it. And then also user experience problems related to resource consumption. I'll come back to some of these slides. There's some good data here that we can use to kind of tie back how we actually pulled everything together and how that, after you walk through everything, the relevant data points. And I'll come back to these to kind of just recap everything, but we'll talk about some of these circumstances. And the last one was an issue around a domain controller causing slow logons. Now, these are, broadly speaking, issues with logon duration, slowness, and resource conditions that are causing those. Availability and changes in configuration that result in problems for users. Those are issues that generally affect a lot of our customers and common conditions that they encounter. I'm going to show you how we actually help them identify those very, very quickly. So I'm going to switch into the technology now so we can actually talk a little bit about that. Now, the first use case I'm going to go into is actually the one surrounding CHI and actually MTM. And so as I'm bringing up the technology, which you should see now on your screen, this is actually the product interface. We're actually on the application availability monitor. This is one of our screens that provide overall uptime and availability across the top, and you can see an enumeration of all the different test launches that we're actually executing. Now, in the case of MTM and also CHI, somewhat similar type of an architecture and deployment, what we had deployed is we had our technology out there to a number of different sites. In the case of MTM, it was just up in the cloud. One endpoint of our application availability monitor deployed in data centers in different time zones to mimic the outside users. And in the case of CHI, we actually had our technology deployed on-prem at the different sites, different hospital sites signing in. And so what the technology does, by the way, and this kind of lends itself to these different circumstances, is it follows the same process that a user does. One of the cool things, of course, with Citrix is that the architecture lends itself to HA and to an HA and always available redundant architecture. So you can have components down and still be delivering a good experience. So that's where something like this really fits in to really confirm users are going to have good experience. So what we're doing from those sites is we're actually going to follow the same actions that users do. So we'll actually launch a session passing through the credentials, handling things like disclaimers and prompts along the way to find out, make sure everything is working the way it should be. And the cool thing is that by taking these individual steps, we're confirming other characteristics. Authentication tells us that that's the passing through credentials getting to this page, so the authentication works, storefronts responding, we're enumerating, which means SQL behind the scenes, the DDC is working, and then we're able to establish the micro VPN connection directly back up, launch the applications. These are all good things that we're actually confirming all the functions behind the scenes. And what's unique about this technology is that when it's doing this, we're actually leveraging APIs. So as it's taking each one of those steps, we don't care if something shows up behind the screens and minimized. So it's running on a scheduled basis, centrally managed without having to actually manually execute it, because if you have to manually execute it, it's too late and the problem could already have been happening. This allows you to truly be proactive. And the other thing is by picking up this information this way, there are certain events and problems that take place, whether it's licensing or configuration related at the NetScaler level, that you only get prompts on the endpoints, and we can pick that data up, especially when there's changes in the environment that take place. So that's what's happening from each one of those sites. And in the case of MTM, that data, which now shows up in this display, is what they leverage to prove that their service truly is up and available and working the way that it should be. And they have the ability to show proof that things are actually working. And you can see it's just launched another session. Now, in the case of CHI, they were actually getting an indication much like this third row here, where we were setting off alerts saying at 4:30 in the morning that there was a problem taking place. Now, when they went into it, what's cool is that they can actually see each step of the process of what's happening, the screenshots here for each stage. They can see it passing through the credentials, taking a screenshot of each step until the last one where the applications, much like we see here, were not available. Now, it was a coding application for CHI, but the insurance coders was launched to actually start doing billing and things of that nature, which of course, executive management was very interested in. And if they couldn't do that, then the hospital wasn't getting revenue. So we set up an alert notification about this. The apps team had recently done an update, and as a result of that, the application was no longer published. They didn't know that that had happened, and the Citrix team had no reason to believe that that would be the effect of the update that they had executed. So they never tested for it separately, but the technology was running and we identified that circumstance. They were able to go back in, they republished the app. I guess the executable moved to a different directory following that change. They republished the application and the users had no idea that there was a problem that was going to take place, and that was completely averted. 40,000 users was the impact across that organization that were going to be using that application several hours later. They had plenty of time to get ahead of it and mitigate that problem. So this is really helpful for those issues. Yes.
I have a question for you. So you're working with this CHI, obviously a medical related business. So does your technology, do you have anything with like specific functionality for medical type apps, say like EMR?
Yeah, so we have some specific things that we've done for Epic, for example, for Cerner, as well as Meditech and the other common ones. So there are specific things that we've done for those different situations, absolutely. Especially because, you know, when those things go down, the impact is huge. We've had a case with one of our customers, one of their facilities, George Washington University Hospital. And this gets more prolific, especially when it's like a hosted solution. So what happens in those cases, and this was with one of our customers, UHS, their users had started calling and saying they couldn't get access to the EMR EHR app. It was disconnected, they were getting disconnected, it was slow. And when they get above like 100 to 150 doctors complaining like that, they just kick it up to the, in that case, Cerner, saying that, hey, there's a problem with the app, go take a look at it. Well, it could take them 4 hours to 48 hours to go through their diligence. In this circumstance, they took a look at the board and they saw actually that everything was green right across the board from that site and location. We actually can deploy this to multiple locations. Each one of these would be those sites, and they just went to the one for GW, took a look at it, and everything was green across the board in that case. And they were able to show proof to local IT that, hey, we're not going to kick this up to Cerner. There's something, this is working fine from your site. Turned out there was an access point where there was actually only one access point working in that case. And we were able to prove that everything was able to launch and establish to Cerner, which was hosted for them. And then the problem ultimately ended up after they investigated was that all the other access points were down, and that was the problem. So yeah, we do integration through that support for all those other vendors, the EMR EHR vendors too.
Okay, well, speaking of like hospitals, I know that hospitals, of course, they're not the only business that have very complex environments. They've got multiple data centers and failover stuff, and because they can't afford any downtime. You really don't want to be in the middle of a heart transplant and the OR go down, you know, or the computers in the OR go down. So do you work with these very complex environments that can help me rapidly troubleshoot stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple ways in which that fits in, and that kind of actually lends itself to kind of the next step in this process. But there's a couple ways that we do that in the case of those very complex situations. First of all, 4 minutes of downtime. For one of our customers, they said each minute is like $140,000 it costs them for a minute of downtime. So you can imagine, even if it happens one time a year, it's really, really bad for them, right? The cool thing with this is because it's centrally managed and it's running autonomously, they can have it set to run on a schedule. So if they wanted to confirm, for example, that a machine in the OR is going to be used starting at 10 o'clock the next day, or generally starts at 10 o'clock, they can have this executing from there at 8:30 in the morning just to make sure everything is okay, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to execute and launch. They do that from all the different sites and locations just to make sure, especially when changes take place, they can't afford to find out because the 5th or 10th person called in and then they started digging in deeper. And so we do a number of different things there. There's a lot of things we've done for adopting different types of configurations. So as you know, that you can have different types of disclaimers at different points. You can have different handling, different types of authentication methodologies, and we support all of those out of the box. The other thing is that because this is integrated into a full-on performance monitoring solution, we can also see the other side of the results too. And by establishing an actual session, passing through the NetScaler, passing through all those components, if it's going to cause, it's running into a problem and it's triggering issues with group policies on the login side of things or application crashing, as soon as you bring it up, we'll trigger those events off and it'll work hand in hand then with the rest of the performance monitoring technology itself. And I'll kind of delve into that in a few moments here. But Webster, did I kind of touch on or address some of the question that you had there?
Yeah, I got one more. I got one more if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead. No, absolutely.
Your thing there says application availability. What if I publish desktops?
Desktops are fine as well.
Okay.
Yep,
So
we do
whether I
support
publish desktops or apps, you can
Yep.
monitor that stuff for me. Okay.
Yeah, you know, this wasn't necessarily the intent of it, but once upon a time with EdgeSite, they had a module called the Application Availability Monitor, and I think that was right, Active Application Monitoring, my apologies. And it kind of struck us as kind of interesting because we kind of do a somewhat similar, but though we're different, we support the storefront, it supports 7.x. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the point of the desktop is to deliver the app, right? So that's what we felt it was okay to keep calling it that. But it's a good question. We do support desktops. We can launch a VDI desktop as well and confirm that that's okay too.
Okay. All right, I'll leave you alone. You can get back to your session.
No problem. You know, so as we talk about slowness issues and problems that are taking place, this is kind of critical for both the CHI situations where you have a single event where there's a logon problem, identifying that before users get impacted, or in the case of like a hosted environment where they need to be able to confirm that things are truly available. And this provides a good way of proving that overall availability. Now, when problems are happening with more slowness and user experience related issues, the big question is, there's a couple questions that you have really. One is this affecting everybody or is it affecting one person? And you start the whole troubleshooting process. The way we look at it in this technology, we have visibility from the infrastructure level down to the individual user and the individual user back to the overall architecture. So when we go, one of those screens that kind of present that information is our topology view. And we've had cases with customers where they start seeing lots of slowness problems. Snow days are a good example of that. If they have holiday times, et cetera. And the question becomes, how are they supporting that environment and user experience? So when users start calling in about slowness problems, or even if they're not, you need to get visibility into how is the overall architecture behaving, this is a great way to kind of get that visibility. And so what this display does, by the way, it's going to automatically map out your architecture. So this is the physical architecture, so your NetScaler, storefront, delivery controllers, AD. So we'll even get into, how many failed logons, any replication errors, all those relevant data points you need to know about. We'll give you that validation. But what's really cool about it is not just the physical layout. And by the way, we do all that automatically, but we also do a logical representation. And this is where it gets really important to visibility to the user experience and understanding what's happening with the users and troubleshooting that. Because when you select any one of these, we're going to automatically present the environment and adjust its look to map out all the way to the host and cluster supporting those delivery groups and machine catalogs. So we had a case with a customer that had users complaining about slowness on Fridays between 10 to 1 o'clock, and only on Fridays. And the problem with those is like, well, what's unique about that day? They use the same applications every single day. What's different on that point in time? And in this case with this customer, they had all the different teams getting together, coming into the office and meeting together in a conference room every single week to try and figure this thing out. And what we're able to do from this screen is bring together all those layers, the network storage, user experience, at that delivery group level and roll it up there. And so when you look on the right-hand side for this user, you're going to see some of the core resource metrics. So we're actually doing a full-on integration into the ICA protocol, able to break out all the lower individual layers that actually contribute to it. So on the right-hand side, we're able to actually identify those circumstances very quickly. And in this case, with this customer, they're able to look at this and say, okay, hosting side for them is fine. They're not using that many resources. Logon duration's okay. ICA latency and the resource and the network connection look absolutely fine. And as they worked their way down, they saw at the next level, the machine level, that the disk latency for storage was getting to like 4,000, 5,000 milliseconds. So they knew immediately that in that time frame, there was something that was causing high storage latency and affecting everyone that was in this machine catalog, which is the people that were actually complaining. And then working our way back, we were isolated to the cluster. And what was interesting is that when we got to the different host levels, whereas at the cluster level, we were seeing that persistently over that 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock time frame. On the host level, we would see it from when we went to each and every single host, we would see the spiking of storage latency for, like a 15 to 30 minute block in the beginning. The next one would be starting thereafter, the next host after that, time frame after that. And from here, we were able to go back to that storage team and not just say, hey, there's some latency there, but also look at the rest of the team members and show conclusively that, hey, hosting team, everything is fine. Networking guys, everything looks good. Citrix guys, everything is absolutely fine. And focus on that networking and the storage team and saying, look, this is the behavior. Turned out that they had snapshot-based backups taking place at that time. Change the schedule, problem went away. So when there's problems that are happening that are causing issues in performance, for example, with MTM, with the Anywhere app, this is a good place that they can go to kind of validate that there's enough resources and they're not having a macro of issues affecting lots of users. So for hosting providers, for Citrix admins that are looking at the overall health of all of their users, this is a great way to kind of validate or perhaps identify problems that might be affecting users. So this is a quick way to kind of get that visibility. And this dovetails back in with when there's problems with users that are having issues. There was a case, and this is one of the next use cases, where users were experiencing overall kind of like lag and sluggishness. And it was difficult to get to the bottom of what was actually causing the problem itself. Ultimately ended up being a CPU issue, but it started to manifest here as we looked at some of those individual hosts. We're rolling up from the round trip times, and we saw users had high ICA round trip times. Now, when we go into the actual Zen app and Zen desktop session display, this is important because from here we're able to see very quickly what's actually happening for the individual user. So this screen brings together both real-time and historic sessions. And we can actually search for those users from here. So for a help desk person, this is the place where they normally start the process of troubleshooting an individual user issue. And so from this display, you're going to see all the relevant data points that they need to understand what's going wrong or what's going on with the user session. So we can actually drill down from here to begin troubleshooting. So let's talk about that next use case where user experience problems related to resource and performance issues. And Webster, related to how we kind of work with our customers in the healthcare industry, when they have slowness problems and any kind of sluggishness, generally speaking, clinicians don't have the time or the ability to be patient enough to kind of work through those problems. If it's not responsive, they abandon it. And this helps them identify why is it not responsive and getting to that root cause. And this is one of the other ways in which we work with them. Application availability monitor, confirming overall availability, and when there's problems taking place, they dig down into it from here. So let's talk about that next use case. So we had a case with one of our customers that had users complaining about slowness. And looking at this type of a display, this allows us to kind of dig into and find out what's actually happening. There's a number of different tabs here at the top that allude to performance in the environment. We have one for logon duration, and the other ones across the top that pertain to general session performance related issues. So this is a quick way to kind of see that type of visibility and dig down into it from here. So this is one of the areas that we look at for those types of circumstances. When we're looking at slowness, one of the first questions that we ask is it slow? We want to understand, is it slow because of a network connection, or is it slow because of user experience, or sorry, resource consumption? So there's two key metrics, and the first, the easiest way to approach that is to disqualify the network end of it. And there's a couple cool things that we're doing here that really help to conclusively achieve that. We're breaking out each layer of the ICA protocol. ICA round trip times, which most people are probably familiar with, is a combination of the network latency, which is driving ICA latency, and anything above that is user experience, resource consumption inside of the session itself. And so this allows us to very quickly kind of identify that. And looking on the network side of things, we can see if network latency is high. At the end of the day, it's never going to be better than the network latency for the user's connection. And we're getting that in real time through the ICA protocol. So This isn't your standard ICMP from the network side. This is coming from the protocol in real time. Another end of it we're looking at is the connection speed. At the end of the day, how much bandwidth they have for Citrix receiver is important to look at. Now, on those endpoints, especially in this day and age, you've got antivirus tools. You might have like FireEye or Cylance doing investigation and analysis of what's going on. Windows or even a thin client is going to have other components installed on there. And the OS is going to treat them with the same priority as Citrix. So Citrix is never going to get the full pie. So if you have a gigabit connection going in there, Citrix is never going to see all of it. And this will show us how much of the overall connection speed the user has on that endpoint just for Citrix. So these are a quick way to find out if there's a network-oriented condition that's causing those problems. And in this case, there's not, much like in the use case we had with our customer. And so the next thing that we take a look at then is the round trip times and ICA latency. Two different pieces of this. So ICA latency is going to tell us if there's something on the resource end of things on the server side to support it, and the round trip time, anything above the ICA latency, tells us if there's something going on inside the user's session that's consuming resources that's causing a delay in presentation. And so here we can ask.
For you.
Go ahead, Webster.
On the ICA latency,
Yep.
how do you detect and troubleshoot high ICA latency?
So the first thing that we do is we have to take a look at these three components of it, right? So on the ICA latency side, if it's just high ICA latency and the round trip times are just kind of matching up to it, the first place I look at is network latency. If the network latency is matching up to it, much like we kind of see here where those spikes are aligning, if its network latency matches up and that's driving it, it's a network condition. You know, it's nothing on the server side. Now, if the server side, if we see ICA latency getting higher than the network latency, I go over to the server performance tab, where this is going to bring back all the resource consumption of what's happening on that system. And all the data points on here are aligned. The ICA latency tab and the CPU memory utilization that we see here in the middle are totally aligned. So I can find out if that's what's actually causing those resource consumption issues, if there's load on that system that's actually might be contributing to it. I think I might be a little bit ahead of you. I think GoToMe might be lagging behind me right now. So give it a couple of seconds, but I can look at this portion of it and understand if that might be driving it. So I've had cases with customers, like we did a couple of projects with HP Enterprises and Rolls-Royce, where they had users that were being delivered CAD applications, and they'd kick off processing of a rendering, and they'd have like 16 processes using like a full core of CPU apiece, and you'd see a spike in CPU ready go to like 10, 12, 13%. And at the same time, you would see ICA latencies climb up at the exact same time. Network latency would stay pretty steady, but this would start to climb above and beyond it. And you can correlate between the connection performance and that server performance to see those spikes of what's happening. In fact, I think we can see a little spike here that takes place, the CPU aligning with a little spike of ICA latency. So yeah, does that answer your question, Webster?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, that's actually one of the cool things with this is that every now and then we'll see some sessions, actually somewhat frequently, where you'll get like network latency getting up to like 2,000 milliseconds all of a sudden, or like 500, 600 milliseconds. And generally speaking, that would render the session almost useless. But you'll notice on the ICA latency side that it's flattened that out. So all of the cool things that Citrix protocol does to do like pixel caching and keyboard caching to keep things moving, you can see how it kind of gets to work here and it kind of smooths out those performance issues and those behaviors and addresses and takes care of it. So that's one of the cool things with like seeing this kind of a breakout in this way. You can really kind of see what's happening. We've had customers use this, for instance, to make decisions and look at, say, like considering the alternative ways of delivering ICA using UDP, looking at FrameHawk as an option as well for those high latency connections, and being able to isolate the network latency out as being a condition of those user sessions. So this is a cool way to actually see that and start making some of those decisions. Now, in this case, we can see the high round trip times. That's telling me that there was a problem, that this user was doing something in the session that was causing some lag. And so the next step that I would do in that case, and this is similar to what we were seeing with our customer, I take a look and find out what was actually going on. So going into the channel, I can actually break out all the different layers around the actual connection. And at the end of the day, what we care about is how is Citrix or the connection supporting the delivery and the visualization of data? What's happening in the data center to those endpoints? And that's always, to some extent, impacted by what the user is actually doing and how much bandwidth has to be delivered back through. And this breaks that down for us. What's actually using it? Thin wire is the presentation layer. Anything above an 800K tells us there's a lot of graphics and pixels that are changing. We've had cases where you have like a print driver goes bad and starts chewing up lots of bandwidth. You'll see the printer bandwidth show up here along the way. If you're streaming audio, you'll see the audio bandwidth present up there. And we'll also see things around, drag in dictation on the medical side. You will see that channel being shown up here as well. So this is pretty cool. In this case, we see the spike that takes place. And this spike, interestingly enough, kind of correlates back with the spike that we see briefly on the ISA latency side, but more importantly, on the round trip time for ISA RTT. So that's actually what's pretty cool. So looking at the vGPU end of things, and this is kind of interesting, right? So we're seeing the memory utilization just going absolutely through the roof, right? We're seeing a spike in GPU utilization at that exact same time. Some frames are going through. So, all right, we know there's something on the presentation side that's taking place that's causing that spike, resulting in the behavior that we see with the round trip time, making the session just absolutely horrible for the session. And then we can go into the application layer to find out what the user had going inside of their session. So let's take a quick look at that. And what's interesting about it is that we can actually see not just all these different processes here, but we can also take a look at the applications that are actually running inside of that session. So in this case, we see a couple different things that are going on. It looks like they have some kind of a map that they had up in PowerPoint, so doing some kind of presentation related things. And so that allows me to have some context when I go back to that user to find out, well, what are they doing in PowerPoint? Or in this case, Chrome, that might be contributing to that user experience. And we know the presentation of it, right? We know that we hit the GPU pretty hard at that time. We knew that the connection had a high spike in round trip time. So we see all those pieces kind of tie together. In the case of our customer, we saw that they had a spike in round trip time in the same way, although in their case, we saw not a presentation in vGPU load, but we saw a presentation in that case of the customer in CPU load. And getting up to like almost 100% persistently of CPU utilization in the case of the customer. In this case, we see some of those same CPU spikes in the same way, getting up to like 75, 80%, and that aligning to the actual connection performance issues and the ICA round trip time spikes that we see here too. So you can see the 800 milliseconds showing up at the exact same time. And so in the case of this user, the CPU spikes are aligning to the video streaming that was taking place at the exact same time. So this is a cool way to kind of get that full presentation and see how things are kind of tying together.
Nice.
I did want to touch a little bit on logon duration, just to kind of round this out. The other circumstance we have with customers, the other use case is that they had problems with slow logons. Before I get into that, Webster, did you have any questions about what I just stepped through? We can certainly cover it more towards a little bit further on, but
no, I no additional questions. I will have a question on logon duration once you get a little bit more into it.
Okay, sure, no problem. So there's some really cool things that we're doing with logon duration. We're actually collecting information somewhat similar to what Citrix does here at the top, breaking down the high-level stages. But what's really interesting is, and you might remember this from EdgeSite, we're breaking down what's going on in the delivery controller during the brokering phases and the endpoint with Citrix receiver startup, and then finishing that off on the bottom half here around logon duration. So when they get handed off to that session host, everything that happens thereafter. So what's really cool about this, we've had cases with customers that have issues around authentication. Well, we're seeing how long, in this case, authentication takes during the initial part of that launch and initiation of the session phase. If there's any kind of a delay, for instance, in handing the user off to the session host, we're going to break that part out. We've had cases with customers that something's wrong with receiver on the endpoint. We're going to actually break out the actual receiver startup times. With 7.x, the logon script execution profile load time, depending on how you have those policies set up, actually start during the delivery controller side of things. And we'll pick that information up from here as well. Now, in the case of our customer, they had a specific problem where they would see logons being slow for certain users. And when they went into here and looked at those individual users and looked at the logon time, what they noticed is that when they got into the bottom phases, we're breaking out the different domain controllers, how long is it taking to copy over the files, folder redirection, drive mapping, all those other components that were taking place too. In their case, they were seeing that some of the authentication was taking place to a domain controller, not inside the data center. And this is what's happening at the session host level. So the session host, even though it's in the data center, the authentication wasn't taking place there. It was happening at the different satellite office that the user was situated at. That was creating some artificial latency and copying over the group policies. It was taking like somewhere between 60 seconds to a couple minutes to actually copy over group policies, which should have only been taking times like we see here. We had cases with other customers where they had like scripts that are executing, and they could see each one of those scripts, the name gets called out, and they saw that it was taking like 30 seconds. So this was able to identify those individual components and get to the bottom of it. In our use case, they were able to identify that the domain controller is going to the wrong one, and when they started digging into, they were able to identify that as being the problem. And as soon as the users were always, there was a replication issue taking place. Once they resolved that replication problem, they were able to, the sessions were always authenticating inside the data center, and the problem went away. So this is really huge for them to be able to identify that nuance of the overall logon process and get to the bottom of it. This information is collected automatically, and we store it historically. So they're able to review this over a couple sessions, because what makes logon times difficult sometimes is that you can have differing experiences. Certainly in this case, if they went and authenticated through the domain controller they were supposed to, or they went to the wrong one, they can have different sessions or differing experiences, and they're able to kind of nuance that out very, very quickly by looking at this.
All right, so that's my question. So the data is collected in real time, so I can actually see this breakdown in real time, but then you're also storing it historically, so I can go back and review, so I can look at things where domain controller stuff and group policy stuff is slowing things down.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's important, because sometimes you don't know what data you need to troubleshoot these conditions, and if the opportunity is passed, and especially if you've got VDI and they reboot, they get reset, you have non-persistent VDAs, you've lost all that data. You're starting from scratch. And oftentimes if you have failed logons or the session crashes along the way and a reboot, you've lost it. Not in this case. We collect this information in real time and we store it in the database, so you can always go back and pull this back in and analyze it. So this is huge for getting into the root cause of those types of circumstances and identifying them.
Okay, so a kind of a side trip question, and I don't know, this may be something you're going to talk about later. You talked about you're storing this data, so I've got historical access. How much data are you storing? I mean, or am I going to get like 7 days, 30 days, 90 days of data?
Yeah, you actually get full control over how long you keep the data and which data you keep for whatever time frame. So some of our financial institutions, enterprises keep it for 13 months, and they can certainly elect to do so. We have some cool things that we do because along the way, whether it's a performance-related event or there's actually faults and errors taking place, there's a lot of good information in the event logs. We do pull that information in too, so you can correlate that. This information, we have the ability to go and take that data. Looks like we have a problem with one of our databases actually. So we can actually pull this information and we'll shove it into a GZIP file on a SAN, and we can always pull back, do reporting against it and pull it in. So that keeps the database size manageable. We're also storing just metadata, so you don't have the full contextual information for every single event when it's not necessary. So you can keep data for 13 months without requiring terabytes and terabytes of database size to actually achieve that. So this is that's one of the cool things that we can do. Oftentimes you have customers keeping like session information. They need to understand where they were going in the environment for those 13 months. So maybe elect to keep like the application performance data, especially for those events that were not being alerted against, for like maybe 2 weeks. And for those processes that did generate an alert, we allow you to keep that information for those same 13 months or more. We've had some customers keep event log data, for example, for like 7 years for audit purposes in the financial industry.
Okay,
You
so
have full control.
if I can keep this stuff for 13 months or so, um, am I charged extra for my Goliath licensing if I want to keep data for 13 months versus I just want to keep it for like 3 months or maybe 1 quarter? Does it cost me more?
No, not at all. We actually keep this we don't have any pricing based upon that. It's a flat rate. If you keep it for 1 day or if you keep it for 30 years, there's no extra charge.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Or
Unlike
for
some
that
other
matter,
vendors, right?
no charge on the basis of the size of data or volume as well. Yeah, there's no charge for that.
Okay.
I did want to touch on a couple other things real quickly. One of the cool things we see a lot of our customers taking advantage of is also the automation and remediation capabilities. So we talked a little about some of the troubleshooting processes. Well, we also have monitoring rules and conditions built into the technology to help you kind of facilitate those processes. Beyond performance-related issues, there's going to be issues around like applications crashing. Of course, the core Citrix components, we have built-in intelligence. We've been working with, actually, I think we've been working with you for quite a few years now, Webster, about 5 years or 6 years, and we've been working with Citrix, collectively, probably about 50 years worth of experience amongst some of the team members, going back about 15 years apiece. And we built in all that data and intelligence into the technology itself, so you don't have to go figure out what to monitor for. But what that also helps with is giving you some of the starting points to start doing some automation for addressing them. So for example, if you have Prince Spooler services that fail out, and that's pretty common, we can certainly alert you to that. And most people have it set up inside Windows Services to restart it. Well, we can look to see if it fails to restart. And if that happens, we can do the same action that you would normally do. So we can execute a remediation that had to go kill the process, clear the print queue, and start the service back up. If drive space starts to get filled up on your VDIs, we can execute a script that will go and clear out your temp directories, buy you a little bit more time before it starts causing problems. So we can use any of the events, whether it's a performance-based threshold or an event, to trigger off either a PowerShell script, a VB script, a patch file, whatever you want to resolve problems. If you have some applications in your environment that have some unique behaviorisms, we can also set up a conditions around that too for your line of business apps to facilitate those processes. So that's something that's built into the technology that you can take advantage of.
Okay, well, cool. Before you go on, I see you have AWS, and I saw something earlier when you were scrolling around for Azure, so I can actually monitor my stuff in the cloud.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the technology is that we definitely support AWS and Azure. And depending on the data that you need, if you need to get a little bit more application specific, you need to get past that platform level type of information, we can deploy our agents into those machines. They run around 0.1 to 0.3% of a CPU core, and they use about 15 megs on disk and around 50 to 60 megs of RAM, which means that you're not getting a lot of that I/O charge I used to, depending on what kind of disk solution you chose. So you're not getting additional charge and hit up a lot by having monitoring tools deployed in the environment. Especially if you need that lower level visibility. So we do have support for that. And the technology profile is aligned to support those types of conditions. So we do have monitoring support for Azure, for AWS. So if you're using like a hybrid type of an architecture, you might be spinning out into and bursting out into the cloud platforms, especially during like holiday seasons if you're in retail. The technology, if you have it on-prem and it suddenly moves out to the cloud, we'll handle that gracefully and continue to check in and enable that monitoring even as it moves out to the cloud side.
Okay.
So that's something we absolutely support.
All right, so Citrix is now starting to do stuff with Google Cloud, and they've got a good relationship, that's building there. Are you going to provide something, like if Google Cloud starts really becoming popular, will you also provide stuff for Google Cloud?
Yeah, you know what? A lot of what we're doing here, we did it in a fashion that makes it somewhat agnostic. The cool things with Google's Cloud is that seemingly a lot of the experience from a resource perspective, it's lightning quick. The latency is great and all those things, but getting this type of visibility that we've had today to kind of confirm and validate that is really important. And so yeah, we do support that. And if you're using Google Cloud, you can deploy the technology there as well, for sure.
Okay, good.
Just going to recap, we touched on a lot of different areas, so I'm just going to bring up those use cases real quickly so we can talk about them, and just kind of recap real quickly here. So one of the use cases that we went to initially, especially from an end user experience perspective, was around network performance problems, and these are screenshots specifically from that customer, and we were able to actually find those latency spikes where we saw high network latency, high IC latency, and at the same time, connection speed actually just falling out entirely. And so those disconnects, we were able to kind of tie that all back together very, very clearly. There was also some application crashes that took place at the same time as a result of the session getting disconnected abruptly. So we were able to kind of provide that type of visibility. A little bit more aligned to what we talked about. We had a case with a customer where they had user experience problems around resource consumption. And as I mentioned, we see the high IC around trip time where it manifested in our environment with high frames per second, and we had a vGPU in play. So probably that's why we didn't see as high of a CPU usage as we do here. It allowed us to kind of push that off to the GPU. In this case, when those spikes took place around trip times, with a high round trip time, we saw the high CPU trend in utilization and a little bit higher memory utilization too. You can see it pegged here at around 100% of CPU utilization. So this was a quick way to kind of get that visibility, and we follow the same process that we did in our environment. These metrics, being able to, and this is something uniquely that we do, and being able to call out that each of the layers of the ICA protocol and see that align next to each other is so important to be able to get conclusively and isolate to the right aspect of the architecture where the problem is taking place. So that's really huge for that. And then, oops, I lost my mouse. There we go. And so the next piece here, just being able to see a little bit more about, so that was just a couple of things that we actually went through the course of the session itself. We also talked about logon duration and being able to get into what was actually happening with respect to the actual delay the logging on, identifying the domain controller, seeing and confirming that the delivery part of it, the brokering portion of it, the endpoint and the Citrix receiver contribution to it is huge to be able to actually eliminate that from that, and then being able to identify the domain controller specifically as being the problem was really important to that piece too. So we're breaking out all those different legs of the journey to give you better visibility to the overall experience inside the session itself. Webster, was there any questions about some of the use cases that we had?
Well, on the previous one, the client use case number one, I've worked on cases where you've got users coming in from another country, and it's, we believe it's their internet connection that's causing the issue because we can't see anything wrong. So have you been able to prove or help prove that it's on the user side and not my side? Is not my responsibility, it's over on the user's responsibility?
Absolutely. And actually, I'm kind of glad we have this screen up still, because that's really where the connection speed kind of comes into it. That's being measured from the user's endpoint. Now, we're not deploying anything there, but it's the user's endpoint, how much speed they have for Citrix. So there was a customer of ours, they're a large multinational. They had a large development staff in India. And what was interesting is they knew they had a bad internet connection. There was about 150 users in that site. They had about a 10 meg connection. And we could see in the connection speed there in the middle of the screen, that squiggly line there, that they were getting around, a megabit, 750 to a kilobit to 1 megabit per second. And so they went and upgraded the internet connection there, and they brought in, and they really upgraded. They brought up, I think it was like 150 meg connection. What was interesting is following that change on the networking side, users' connection speed dropped to like 30 kilobit per second, 100 kilobit per second. And what they were able to see is, when we looked at all the user sessions, we saw all of a sudden the client IP address had suddenly changed. When they went back to the users, not only did they get a network change, but they got a hardware refresh, and the users were on Wi-Fi. As soon as they changed that from Wi-Fi to wired, user connection speed jumped up to about I think it was 3 megabit per second on average to around 5, 7 megabit per second. Some people were getting 20, 30 megabit per second. So that was enormous to be able to identify those conditions. We did still use those ICA metrics at the top just to understand that, how is that, what are the implications? But that connection speed metric was really important. Generally speaking, when you go out to, like, say, Southeast Asia, the best you're going to see for network latency is around 190 milliseconds. More often, it's around like 220 milliseconds. And we saw as they changed from Wi-Fi to wired connection, their network latency dropped from 220 milliseconds to 185 milliseconds. So they were actually doing really good after that, really kind of being able to optimize the connection itself. So this was really critical to that. We've had the similar circumstances, not just with Southeast Asia, but we've had cases where there's like bad routing and for offices in Europe and South America. We have a couple multinationals in the transportation industry, freighters, where they have users that are coming in from Brazil, from the Middle East, from Europe, and all sorts of different connection speeds that are going on. And this tells them explicitly how much connection speed they have for Citrix. That's the first place to look, because so much of the connection drives the user experience. And addressing that first can start really kind of improving overall user experience inside of those sessions. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very useful.
Yep.
Take the stress off me.
This screen is really what we use in those circumstances. That can help answer and address all those problems for sure. Well, looks like Webster, the demo gods are not with me right now. I did get to the end of the show. I can't bring up the Q&A screen, but I don't know if you had any other questions you wanted to delve into at this point.
Well, back on the historical data. So am I able to keep the detail, or are you rolling stuff up and then I'm just getting averages once I get past like 30 days, 90 days or something, or what?
That's a great question. So we don't roll up the data. You maintain that granularity. And again, we're storing the metadata. So one of the challenges with other tools that don't do that, and if they do keep the granularity, is that it can cause tremendous growth rate for data itself. But because we're only keeping the metadata, you can keep all the granularity and still not cause a tremendous amount of database growth and size, and still keep it relatively manageable. And that's important because when you're trying to troubleshoot these types of circumstances, whether it's logon duration conditions, user experience and performance, trying to understand how network latency and connection speed might have been changing over time and impacting user experience and round trip times, you need those data points. If you roll it up too far, you lose some of the important nuances of behavior, whether it's changing experience over times of the day, and things of that nature. So we don't roll up that data. You maintain that granularity, so you have that full control.
All right. Well, since I have all the data, can I feed it to a third party, say like Splunk, so I can do my own analysis and stuff like that?
Absolutely. One of the interesting things we see customers doing a little bit more now is using tools like Power BI and Tableau. At the end of the day, the data is yours, right? It's the customer's data. So they have full rights to access the database, pull it into Power BI. They can bring in information from, like, say, SolarWinds or some other network monitoring tools and kind of correlate and overlay that content, or ServiceNow for that matter. We've had customers use data from the ServiceNow and tie that back to our information to show alert notification that we've triggered off, when tickets were resolved, to show how quickly they were able to mitigate and minimize downtime. You can certainly pass it on to Splunk as well, for that matter. There's customers of ours that will take events. When we trigger off on certain events and conditions, we can forward it on using syslog or SNMP, and they might send it on to Splunk for that matter, using that type of a methodology if they wish to, or Power BI or Tableau.
Okay. Well, I have one other question for you, just a generic monitoring type question. We as the Citrix admins, engineers, architects, we're always hearing it's Citrix. Citrix is slow, and we're just like, but it's the application. It's not. Citrix is the server is performing well.
Right.
Citrix, the Zen apps, Zen desktop stuff is performing well. It's the application. So have you been able to help someone actually prove it's the application and not quote unquote Citrix?
Yeah, there's a couple different, depending on the circumstance itself, there's a lot of different ways in which we can help them with those issues. We've had, one of the most prolific problems, especially in like the legal space, is problems with plugins into like Excel and Outlook. And the cool thing is, with our event log visibility, being able to tie that in and correlate it to all this information we have here, we can show and prove that Citrix was delivering everything okay, the networking side was fine, the hosting of the Citrix VDA was good. And you can see, we had this happen a bunch of times. You'll see that the actual plugin crash and an Outlook crash or Excel crash out thereafter. And the problem is, at the end of the day, you need to have this information to see what's taking place, because all the user says to the admin is, Citrix sucks, or Citrix isn't working. And it's really not the case, right? All they know is that they're getting Citrix to deliver something to them. They can't even distinguish whether it was a Citrix session or something that was local on their desktop, especially if it's like a published app. And we have our customers going there all the time, wanting to be able to say, look, you didn't even have a session with that application. That application wasn't even being published through Citrix, improving that. Or when there is a problem, being able to isolate it back to that application and see the different crash events that take place. We actually had a case with, one of the biggest challenges are with, kind of coming back to medical since you brought it up earlier, is tools like drag and dictation. And we've had cases where the applications will crash, and it actually isn't even the application's fault. Certainly not Citrix's fault, but not even the application's fault either. And we can see the DLLs for, say, or the processes that are running these other dependencies to those apps, like drag and dictation, causing a crash for other applications that are being accessed from there. And at the end of the day, Citrix is one that's getting blamed. So not only is it not a Citrix problem or the application's fault, it's another third-party tool or component as well. And we can see all those different pieces. So yeah, we absolutely get that data and provide that visibility. There's also poor or badly behaving apps, if you will, that start leaking CPU and memory. And we have built-in rules and conditions to look for those types of circumstances. So if they start leaking resources or handles start climbing excessively, all those different types of circumstances, we can alert and trigger for those. We have some of that built into the technology, but we've also customized some of those things too, to make sure we can track and identify those poorly behaving applications too, for sure.
That is awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any other questions for you. So
okay.
We're gone.
Yeah, I would,
yep.
I would normally go on to the Q&A screen. It just doesn't seem like GoToMeeting is agreeing with us, however.
No one has posed any questions in the webinar questions thing.
Okay.
So if there's anyone out there that has any questions, ask them in the questions panel there.
Or that means Raja just did an amazing job of going through them, and Webster, you asked all the questions that everyone had.
No.
Yeah, so Stephanie, thank you so much for hosting us today for this webinar. It's been great. And Webster, thanks for moderating and all the good questions along the way too.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. So Raja, did you say you couldn't get to the end slides?
Yeah, it seems GoToMeeting's not agreeing with us today.
No worries. I think I know what to say. So yeah, thank you, Raja. Thank you, Webster. It was a pleasure as usual. Just a couple quick reminders. I put in the chat window for everyone a link to a survey. It's short and anonymous, and it's for CUGC use only. So we always like to get your feedback on our webinars to let us know how we're doing. And I know some of you may have opted in for a chance to win an Amazon Echo Spot or an Amazon gift card. So those winners will be randomly selected after the webinar, and we'll notify you, and we'll announce it on Twitter and on mycugc.org. Tomorrow, you will get an email from GoToWebinar. It will have a link to a recording from today's presentation, as well as a link to a forum thread. If you have more questions you'd like to ask or want to talk about the webinar, that'll be the place to do it. And I think that covers it. So thanks again. Thanks to all of you for attending, and thanks again to Goliath for being
Hey,
with us
Stephanie.
today. Yeah.
We've got, according to the thing, we got one person raising their hand. I don't know what that means. So is someone wanting to ask a question or someone wanting some attention? It's our Canadian friend, Oleg.
I see. Yeah, if you have a question, you can throw it in the question panel really quickly in the last few minutes here.
Or
Maybe
maybe
he's
he was
just,
playing around with the buttons in there and raised his hand.
he could be just waving at us. All right, I guess he doesn't have one. But thanks for noticing, Webster. All right, everyone. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on mycugc.org or at another CUGC webinar in the future. Thanks, everyone.